started. So welcome everyone. I am so excited that we have no extreme weather today. If some of you may recall that we had scheduled this in March and we had what Washington called extreme weather was, I think, an inch of snow, but we ended up having to reschedule because of extreme weather and no rain or anything, so I'm very excited about that. Thank you for coming to this event, Shoring Up Communities, Investing in Resilient Infrastructure. My name is Laura Lightbody. For those of you who I don't know, I do see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. I'm the project director for a program here at Pew called Flood Prepared Communities. Our goal within the Flood Prepared Communities project is to reduce the impact of flood-related disasters on the U.S. taxpayer and the environment, and we do that through federal policy reforms in 4 main areas: the National Flood Insurance Program, disaster mitigation, resilient infrastructure, and nature-based solutions. While, of course, today we are focused on infrastructure, we all know that each of these areas are interconnected, they work in tandem, and solving some of the problems related to the way that our nation prepares for and responds to natural disasters requires a coordinated and holistic approach, a real paradigm shift in the way that we have done things in the past. I am delighted to be joined by a very distinguished set of speakers today, including a sitting mayor and a former mayor. We'll talk more with them a little bit later. To hear how they have really approached resilience and made their communities more resilient, and how policies that are both smart and policies that are lasting can really impact the way our infrastructure withstands natural disasters. Before we get too far into the program, a couple housekeeping items. This event is being webcast. For those on the phone, we are encouraging folks to live tweet. The hashtag, which is up on the screen, is #PewInfrastructure. We will be taking questions both on Twitter and in the audience. There will be microphones for your questions, so just make sure you flag someone down that has a microphone for a question. And the fun and best part is that immediately following this, we will have a reception right behind those doors. So you're welcome to stay for cocktails and appetizers and maybe to ask any last-minute pressing questions you may have. Let me just sort of start this by setting the stage with a couple facts that I find staggering. 39% of the nation's population lives along the shoreline. Billion-dollar natural disasters are on the rise. They used to happen once or twice per year. They're now happening 5 to 10 times annually. Flooding is the most common and costly of those disasters. In 2016, flood losses accounted for about $17 billion in losses. That's 6 times greater than the overall flood damage experienced in 2015. 2016 was quite an unprecedented year. Our policy and regulatory environment has enabled a lot of this with perverse incentives to live in risky areas. We subsidize flood insurance rates for people who live in flood risk areas. We bail out communities and states when they're impacted by flooding. Further, we have encouraged more and more built infrastructure. 14% of the U.S. coastline is hardened. That leads to habitat loss and coastal erosion. All the while, we have historically underinvested in infrastructure over the past years. This undoubtedly increases the risk base for the federal government, places the burden of rebuilding over and over on the nation. It's a vicious and costly cycle that has led the American Society of Civil Engineers to rate the nation's infrastructure a D+, year after year. So what do we do about it? I'm hoping that our speakers will provide us with some of the answers. Well, I know we don't have them all here and we won't figure it all out today. For our part, we have gone around to states and localities to try to understand what has worked and what's working on the ground, and what could inform the federal process. We have spent quite a bit of time in Charleston, as Charleston is a charming city and historic city that has been really threatened by increasing sea level rise and plagued by large flood events. Since Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989, the city has really embraced resiliency. It has taken its issues head on and been very proactive about reducing the threat of sea level rise and reducing the impact of these large events. So to really illustrate that story, we have a short video that we're going to show, and I'm going to let you all watch that. And after that, my colleague Tamara Lozado, who heads up our government relations department here, is going to talk to you a little bit about the mayors that we have here and set up our first discussion.
Charleston is a great city. There's no city like it in America. And every vista of view is really a thing of beauty. When Hurricane Hugo came through, I was right at City Hall, and we felt the full brunt of the hurricane. It was coming at us. This was a killer storm. We got citizens out and evacuated, but the power of a Category 4 hurricane is impossible to imagine.
Hurricane Hugo taught everyone a great lesson about climate change and high tide and storm surge. It was a devastating time for the city of Charleston. During that time, I think the mayor really stepped up and showed his true leadership.
The devastation that I saw going around the city was something I never imagined I would see. But I knew, and I said that morning in front of City Hall, that this city would rebuild, and it did.
Charleston has always had a special relationship with water. In the 1800s, we started measuring tidal elevations in Charleston. And since that time, we've seen approximately a foot of rise every 100 years. In the 1970s, we were seeing 2 to 5 floods every year. Scientists are now telling us that by 2045, we could possibly have 180 tidal floods a year.
I was born and raised in the city of Charleston, and I'd say 69 years, I experienced practically all the high tides and practically all the storms. Before, in the early days, kids would have to walk through water up to their knees. Their sneakers and shoes are wet, and when they go to class, they would have to take them off. In this neighborhood, water used to be practically up to here sometimes. So you see the difference between this house and this house here. This is within code now for this particular area here. All of this come about from Hurricane Hugo and the FEMA code to make sure any residents that are being built have to be at this particular height.
We're called the Low Country for a reason. We're surrounded by water and people love it here. My husband and I purchased this home in Burns Downs in the mid-1980s. As the area grew, there was a need for a larger highway system here. And when the stormwater would run off the highway, it really creates a river, and the street would become a lake. The water would come under their houses and start to infringe on the integrity of the home itself.
Most cities have the benefit of gravity, where drainage is going downhill. We have none of that in Charleston. So what we had to do was engineer a system where the water is collected into shafts that go down under the city to a depth of 140 feet. And then it's pumped up into the river. Even at high tide, it has the power to pump it up. So it's a very expensive engineering process, but it's really the only way to do it.
When Mayor Riley came into office in 1975, that was when they commissioned the first major floodplain management plan for the city. It gave us a way to take something that was very large and break it down into steps to begin to work on the problem.
We now have under construction or have constructed about $240 million worth of improvements, and that's far more than the city's annual operating budget. So we created revenue streams many years ago, a stormwater utility fee, small increase in property taxes, and then matching funds when we could get it to be able to put these pieces into place.
So when the drainage system was designed in our neighborhood, this large street right here was where they put the huge pipe underneath for all the stormwater to come from all the side streets. This is an example of a drain right here, and the water is held here until it can slowly work its way out into retention area and then ultimately to the marsh and the river.
Okay, this is the shaft that they're putting in for the drainage project. And you can see how deep it is to tie into the tunnel and to the pumping station that the city is going to build in between the two bridges. It will be a great help to the flooding in this particular area.
So the master drainage plan has been successful. We've got a lot more to do, but we've completed about 40% of the recommendations, and those areas that we've addressed are seeing less flooding and less impact. We're also looking at softer edges of the city, areas where we may be able to implement some green infrastructure to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff and reduce the amount of water that we need to deal with.
The nature-based solutions are always the best. They break the wave action. They create other marine and aquatic life around it. And then we also have required increased setbacks, so there's more land to have natural accretion through the grasses that grow in that zone. In addressing the challenge of gradual sea level rise, you bring to the table a wide variety of groups, neighborhood organizations, nonprofits, the state and federal resource agencies, and others. But we can't just talk about it. We've got to put the plans in place, and then we got to help create and generate the public will to do it.
We need to work on it together. It's a big problem that affects a lot of folks. And it's also important that FEMA, through its National Flood Insurance Program, support ways to reduce the risk so we're not continually paying out huge insurance payouts and people are not living in fear of flooding.
You know, we're not the only community dealing with gradual sea level rise. This is a national problem. A small community that is facing these challenges just can't do it with their own resources. And a national government has an investment in that, and the public increasingly is understanding the reality of gradual sea level rise.
The coastal environment is a beautiful and fragile environment, and it's a privilege to be here. I think we need to respect where we are and live there in a way that creates a responsibility from our end for the privilege.
As a lifelong resident, I love the flavor of Charleston. And before, Charleston was a diamond in the rough, and Mayor Riley put it on the map.
You begin to solve a problem by embracing it and recognizing it. More weather events, more flooding, and gradual sea level rise. All of the information tells us that's going to increase. We understand the challenge now better. We've got this very good plan in place with great community buy-in, and it works. It's a good, sound, logical blueprint to preserve and protect this beautiful city for future generations.
Thank you.
I think I have to brag about my own organization. Laura, that was a terrific video. And Mayor Riley, thank you so much for helping us present these issues and problems and your optimism for what I think underlies this organization's commitment to finding ways to address public problems through sound, sensible, of course, and effective policy reforms. I am Tamara Lozado, as Laura said, and I run the Government Relations Department here. Most people think Pew is a foundation. We're actually a 501c3 nonprofit and committed to finding ways that we can advance policy reforms, and with a special eye towards the approach is that could bring about those reforms. And I would say that this arena of dealing with, I would say, flood-threatened areas around the country has a lot of potential, and we look for the potential of finding bipartisan champions, finding ways that can both get better results but also produce fiscal, I would say, payoffs and dividends. And the Flood Prepared Communities project exemplifies Pew's overall commitment and our approach to what we think scores policy touchdowns. Right now, it might be hard to imagine, but a lot of great work is being done. I also want to welcome you and thank you for showing interest in this, and hope you will partner with us as you hear about the various issues and areas we're working on. I would like to start, before introducing our amazing panel, by recognizing that former Senator John Warner of Virginia, oh, I worked for the Center of West Virginia, so I mix them up, is here joining us. He's been a longtime special friend of Pew and has helped Pew with a number of areas by being just an extremely effective spokesperson and cage rattler for us. So it's nice to have my usual date that I like to have near me. So thank you. We have, as you know, a panel of 2 mayors, and with a terrific, I'm assuming he'll be terrific, moderator. So I will start by turning to Mayor Riley. Mayor Joe Riley served 10 terms as mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, from 1975 until he retired last year. From 86 to 87, he was president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. In 96, Newsweek magazine named him one of the 25 most dynamic mayors in America. He became what we call here a Pew Distinguished Fellow last June. So in the context of what I do with my department and overseeing the Pew Fellows program, which Senator Warner also has been a member of, and we enlisted him to, given the experience that you heard about in the video, to help advise us in creating this Flood Prepared Communities project, which of course is sponsoring this event. He's credited with, I think, some very nice words of one of your citizens, with the transformation of downtown Charleston to a top cultural destination. And he's known for being a really pretty incredible crisis manager. He led the city's recovery, as you saw, from Hurricane Hugo in 1989, which I'm sure we'll hear more about today. He also helped the city, and I really do personally remember this by finding it to be an outstanding, even contrast to the way some of these experiences were handled. He helped his city heal after the horrific killing of 9 people at that Emmanuel Methodist Church, yes, in 2005, or AME, I'm not sure what the... And there was this wonderful op-ed about the mayor in the New York Times a few years ago, written by the columnist Frank Bruni, who is often quite cynical about various things. But in this column, his headline was, "Is Joe Riley of Charleston the most loved politician in America?" Well, he wrote that for a reason. And now, thanks to a year of we working for Mayor Riley, and certainly I know as someone involved in public service, watching your enormously impressive work, we at Pew know the answer to that question is a resounding yes. To turn to Mayor Jim Brainerd, he's been the mayor of Carmel, Indiana for more than 2 decades. He's got to be something right, because during his tenure, the population of that town has grown from 25,000 to 80,000. Carmel is one of the fastest growing cities in America. Mayor Brainerd's management of that population boon is the textbook definition of smart growth combined with sustainability. so knows a great deal about what we're talking about today. And while overseeing the development of the new downtown areas like City Center and an arts and design district in his city, he also increased Carmel's parks and green space to more than 500 acres. One of his signature accomplishments is an example of his innovative thinking. Carmel has 102 traffic roundabouts or traffic circles, the most of any city in America, and each one saves approximately 25,000 gallons of fuel per year by bringing about that advancement. Mayor Brainerd has endured multiple 100-year storms. It might be Carmel has endured, but you certainly have gone through.
I have to.
During his time as mayor. In fact, just earlier this year, Carmel experienced a 10-inch deluge of rain, roughly a quarter the amount they typically receive in a year in a matter of 5 days. So you guys have kind of disaster tales to share. With his leadership, Carmel has invested more than $60 million in drainage infrastructure since 1996. So, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Mayor, we sure look forward to hearing what you have been doing in your cities. And I will turn to our moderator, who will take my place, Chris Flavelle. He's a reporter for Bloomberg News, covering issues we're discussing today, among the issues. Previously, he wrote editorials on healthcare, energy, and environment for Bloomberg View, and was a senior policy analyst for Bloomberg Government. He's written for Newsweek, Slate, and the Washington Post, and has produced videos for the New York Times website. Chris graduated from McGill University in Quebec, Canada, and studied at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where my stepdaughter went. SIPA? Went to SIPA. So thanks again. Great you're here, and look forward to learning from everyone who has quite a bit of knowledge, and you'll take it away from there. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, guys, for being here. I want to start continuing with the train of thanks. Every time I got a question on resilience or policy, the folks at Pew have been amazing. So a great resource, really impressive, and thank you for hosting this. I'm glad to be here. Mr. Mayor and Mr. Mayor, I wonder if we can just start with sort of a definition of terms. People hear climate change, they think all kinds of things. Give me an idea of what climate change means for your communities right now. Is it a threat? Is it a nuisance? Is it weather? Is it existential? How do you see climate change, and how concerned are you about your communities?
Well, I think we don't need to get into the debate of different ideas about the cause of climate change, and I think that's just helpful to move that aside. And the fact is that it's changing. The frequency of severe weather events has increased. The sea level is gradually rising. So, and so whether it's more frequent storm events that Mayor Brainerd experienced, or we experienced in Charleston, or the increase in the king tides, a few more inches of water change a neighborhood, it's happening. And so I think we have to embrace the fact that it's happening. And it's so important that cities with their citizens lay out a sound plan of attack. And we must be proactive, and we must be forward thinking, and we must have a commitment to resilience, because if we don't, then we're ensuring that our community will be damaged further in the future, and that's not in anyone's best interest, and that's not doing our job.
And then, Mayor Brainerd, it's great that you're here, because I think people will sometimes associate climate change with affecting coastal cities the most severely, but perhaps you can give us an idea of why it's not just coastal cities dealing with these kinds of issues.
Well, certainly coastal cities are going to be impacted, and probably impacted more dramatically in the beginning of our climate change challenges than inland cities. However, cities across the Midwest and inland from the coast are dealing with more storm events each year, and more storm events of greater intensity. I think one year we had 12 100-year rain. 1 year.
Wow.
We are in the part of the country that has tornadoes. In fact, I was thinking, just as I was listening to the introductions, about being in a very similar panel about a year ago with the mayor of Kokomo, Indiana, who's located about half an hour to the north. And this was an event sponsored by the Hoosier, it was a nickname for people from Indiana, the Indiana Environmental Council, and we were in a university building in downtown Indianapolis. We broke up about 1 o'clock in the morning and went back to our respective city halls. Within 2 hours, a third of Kokomo had been destroyed by a tornado. And it was so ironic that we had been in a climate change seminar just a few hours earlier. Even though my city is urbanized, part of the greater Indianapolis metro area, we're very close to farm communities. As the weather changes, different sort of pests are impacting how crops are grown. That's of great importance to some of the farmers. It should be important to all of us. We like to eat. We have those issues. We have the issues of our stormwater management system, how much has to be invested in it. So we're dealing with all these things across the country, simply not in the coastal areas. Fortunately, we don't have hurricanes, but we do have tornadoes. We have heavy rain events. We have weather that's changing and changing very drastically and very quickly.
You're both in red or reddish states. Give us a sense of how your constituents look at this. I think there's a sense on the coasts that, the further inland you go or the further you go into Republican territory, the less agreement there is that this is happening. How do your constituents see these threats, and have you found a good way to talk about them that doesn't sort of veer off into debates about ideology or science?
Let me start with that. Well, I'm a Republican, even though I have the blue tie on, and Joe's a Democrat, and he has the red tie on. But mayors talk to people on the street. They're out in the community every day. And they have an advantage that people in state capitol and the people in the federal capitol don't have, in that we have this daily contact with our constituents. And I have yet to meet anyone of any party who, first of all, wants their family to drink dirty water or breathe dirty air. It seems like, as I talk to constituents, many of them solid, strong Republicans, some from the fiscal side, others from social side. I remind them that, these for many years were nonpartisan issues. It was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, who set aside most of our national parkland. It was Dwight Eisenhower set aside the Arctic Reserve. It was President Nixon and later Ford, after Nixon resigned, that signed the legislation that established the EPA, the Clean Drinking Water Act, the Federal Migratory Bird Act, Endangered Species Act, and so on. It was Reagan that dealt with the ozone hole in Montreal, the Montreal Protocols. So there's this history. I think back about the the Conservation Fund that 50 years ago was authorized on voice vote. 51 years ago now, since we haven't reauthorized it, voice vote in the House and Senate. There was so little controversy about it.
But is there pushback now? Do your constituents say?
No, I don't think so. Sometimes I have to remind people of that. Sometimes you get somebody who wants to talk about the science, and I try not to go there with them if they're coming from that viewpoint. So I go, let's talk about the money we can save. Let's talk about making sure your house or your business isn't flooded,
right,
regardless of the reason. But I find most people in my community pay attention to the science.
Right.
And I think that back to that day-to-day contact we have with our community, I think it's a minority of radio talk show hosts that want to sell ads,
right,
that have perpetuated this myth, and I consider a myth, about the science not being real. And very few people in the country really believe that.
And Mayor Riley, your experience?
Well, and I just don't want to leave this meeting without personally congratulating Senator Warner for his amazing continued public service. He's here today, and a wonderful, great national hero, and just join me in giving him a round of applause. Well, you are, and thank you. And we see it by your being here today. When I was mayor, I always pictured a couple or family at home sitting in front of the television at their breakfast room table or dining room, whatever, and just talk to them honestly about what we were working on. And so that, at the local government, you lay out the facts, what the problems are, what you believe the solutions are, and try to do it in a manner that responds to their heartstrings and explain it respectfully. And so for our $280 million or whatever it was invested, we raised property taxes. We raised stormwater utility fee. We slightly raised business license, and we got a AAA credit rating, and we're not, we have a good, well-run, high undesignated fund balance, all that. But if you tell people what something is going to cost and why you need to do it, then they support you. And so and you have to do that. I know that, and local government's very different because you either do it or you don't do it. I mean, a police officer costs a certain amount of money, and 140-foot pipe under the earth that's 12 feet in diameter costs money too. So you lay it out and you explain it. And I think, running through all of this issue of resilience is that if the citizens are smart, they're smarter than we are, and they know that you have to make investments. And investments are costly, and it's in their best interest, so you lay it out. And so we and I think the red and blue is overstated in some ways because you get national kind of political issues or cultural issues that seem to be somewhat definitive. But citizens want results, and they want their community to be safe. Mm-hmm. And we have a duty as elected officials at the local and the national level to do just that.
We've got, I think, some federal employees in the room. Talk about the split that you see between what local governments can do on their own and what the federal government has to help with. How much assistance did you need as mayor, and do you need now in terms of federal programs, federal support, federal money to protect your residents?
Well, it has to be a partnership. When you see on television that a horrific natural disaster has hit a community, the average citizen would say, well, that's their problem. That didn't hit here. No, they expect the Army Corps of Engineers to be there, or the various national resources. It's part of America. And so I think it's a partnership. We all have our duties and responsibilities, but the national government, because the national government will respond. There were in one way is with programs for resilience and mitigation investments, and the last 9 to 10 years, $277 billion worth of disaster aid a national government had to spend, because you spend it when some place gets wiped out. And $2 billion was invested in mitigation, whereas the studies show that for every dollar you invest in mitigation, you save $4. So I think there is an important opportunity and responsibility at the national level to have programs of mitigation. We're doing that. What you saw on the video was mitigation in Charleston, but if we pretend that it's going to be a localized disaster, citizens not going to want to do that. So it has to be a partnership.
When we spoke earlier, you made the point, I thought was fascinating, that you thought the federal government should help cities with flood damage move people out of flood zones after their homes, if their homes are destroyed, and direct that towards future resilience as opposed to building back in place. That's a controversial idea. Can you talk about that and why that's a good idea?
I think we have to look at the long term. And, I know some instances where homes have been rebuilt 2 and 3 times.
Yeah.
And
or more.
And it just doesn't seem be a common sense thing to keep rebuilding in those areas. Let's turn them into nature areas people can enjoy when they're not flooded, but help the folks that live there get out of those areas so they don't have to deal with it. I think back to the question you asked Mayor Riley a minute ago, too, I want to say that it's important, I think, to look back why the federal government got involved helping the states originally. We went for probably over half our history as a republic. The states were on their own. Cities were on their own for these things. But we decided that, we're a country, we're unified. We need to help those that may get harder than others. That's why we had federal government involvement. For those that weren't hurt, they can help pay for some of the problems in areas that are hurt very badly. And we need that sense of unity to continue. I heard some rhetoric in the Hill this morning I was reading about, every city and every state can be on their own on some of these things. And I think that's a very dangerous attitude, because when disaster hits, we need everybody else to come in and help that area. Next week it may be your city. And that's the value of our federal system.
Let's go to federal policy explicitly. Are there things that, from your vantage point, the federal government should do differently or should do more of, perhaps do less of, to make your jobs easier to protect your cities?
Well, I think investing in mitigation, because these are costly things. I don't know how much money what Jim outlined would cost. I know in Charleston it's several $1 million. We have 48 homes in a suburban part of our city that are always flooded, and the land needs to be acquired and turned into some form of of recreational or mitigation lake or whatever. And so that's beyond the scope of the city. So I think the national government investing in those, and I think we use the FEMA mitigation bank a couple of times in the interest cities. This is an interesting one. It didn't flood, but we did an old theater, and we also have we're in a seismic zone, so we have to retrofit the buildings, and so they had a mitigation program. We were able to, the old theater, shore up the foundations. It was beyond our ability to afford. So I think that's a good role for the national government, with some cost sharing with the local government to provide in this.
The federal budget proposal came out today. The federal government proposes cutting some of these programs, either reducing or eliminating. And one of the arguments they make is that if you give cities and states less money to prepare for disasters, they will find a way to find more money on their own. They'll take more responsibility for those rules. Is that a fair theory, do you think?
No.
Okay. But their point seems sound. If these are important tasks and cities bear the brunt if they're not performed, cities have the greatest incentive to find that money. But you think they won't?
Back to what I was saying a minute ago, we have poor cities and wealthy cities, in between cities. The poorest of our cities need that help. They're not going to find it. Of course, the wealthy ones will find a way if they have good planning to do it. But again, the advantages of this big country, this federal system that we have, which is in essence a partnership between our states and the national government, needs to help those who are the most vulnerable.
And, proposals like that, I mean, the budget came out today, and, at the local level, I mean, I got a lot of good ideas from my citizens that made something I proposed a heck of a lot better, or maybe the original idea wasn't that great. So I think these are coming out of the chute of the new administration, and I think that in this instance, that's not a sound argument, because in the final analysis, the citizens are going to expect a national response. And I think to have a cost-sharing form of a mitigation system produces far better results for the nation as well as for localities.
Let's go long-term for a moment, and then I want to open up to questions. Help us understand, from your point of view, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, what does a very resilient city look like? What should mayors and other local officials do right now, and federal officials to help them, do to prepare cities both for the threats that we know about, but the ones we don't as well? How do you change the way you build, the way you protect, the way you encourage land use decisions? What should we be doing right now so that the damage that we know is increasing, we don't know how much, is lessened down the road?
Well, one of the things I think is important is city design and planning. And quite honestly, as a country, we've done that very poorly since the end of World War II. We have sprawled out compared to the development patterns, the grids that we had prior to 1945, when we had less than a quarter of our population with automobiles, to today when almost everyone outside a few cities along the coast has at least one, if not more, personal cars. We've sprawled out so far that our ability to build infrastructure farther and farther and farther out in a very sprawling development pattern costs so much that we can't do it very well. We need to be smarter. I'll give you one example. Think about a 40,000 square foot lot. If we put surface parking on that lot and build a one-story building on 10,000 square feet. The other option is to build a 5-story building on the entire 40,000 square feet. So the difference is, say, at $2 a square foot in property tax, something mayors tend to think about. It's going to be $20,000 for example A. It's going to be $400,000 if you do the math for example B. And that's just the revenue side. Then you have the cost of the road, $10 million a mile for a 2-lane road, the cost of the sewer pipe, the water pipe, the electric lines, the gas lines, and so on, policing that road, providing fire protection with all this sprawl. Again, 20 times the amount of revenue, for the same amount of private sector capital, 20 times the expense at least from the taxpayers to provide services. Our urbanized areas have sprawled out so far, cities have very little money left for basic infrastructure.
So denser development.
Yeah, I was talking in one city, in a neighboring state, I won't name them to protect the guilty, but they showed me this new area of town, and this old city councilman in the car with us, and he said, I didn't vote for this. And I asked why, and he said, well, it won't make any money. And I said, did you ever work out the numbers? He said, no. So we did, and I used it in my talk the next day. They had developed this new area. They had about $6 million in expenses, about a $3 million infrastructure bond, $3 million in services with fire and streets and police and so on. And then we looked at the revenue they were getting from this newly developed area. It was half the cost. $3 million of revenue because it was sprawl. Had they taken this and built 4- and 5-story structures, it would have been revenue positive. But as a result, they were spending all this money they needed to be using, quite honestly, on other things, social programs and so on, and better infrastructure.
And I guess,
so if I can just make my point quickly, we need to start with designing our cities in a smarter, more fiscally responsible way so that we have money to do it properly.
and Mayor Riley, I guess the problem in Charleston is not sprawl, it's losing land. How do you cope with the situation where you know you'll lose land over time?
Well, I think that that given the increasing acceptance of climate change in all forms, I think that land use planning and community long-range planning has a different lens or filter that you look through now that you didn't 30 years ago. And it's about this issue. Okay, as we look forward, or put climate change in front of us, then infrastructure, make sure that it's built to withstand that. Senator Warner pointed out, to see, we was Secretary of the Navy concerned about Norfolk, but that base is secure, but will people be able to get to and from? So, infrastructure, nature-based solutions that we keep very keen on the riverbanks or watersheds or coastal zones and using what nature can produce and has produced to mitigate the impacts, and then wise implementation of land use plans, the houses up and all that. So again, when I was first elected a long time ago, it wasn't so much on our radar screen. It is now, and that's why this effort is so important, because it's not just the billions of dollars that it will save. I'll tell you, you go through a natural disaster, and the heart-wrenching, emotionally destructive heartbreak that happens when someone loses their home or something important, their community is destroyed, and heaven forbid, lives are lost, then you want to make sure that you're wisely putting into place policies and procedures and investments that mitigate that. It's very important. I think our country has changed, and this is a top-level responsibility now and in the future.
The sharp edge of that, of course, and then please, if you have a question, let me know after this. The sharp edge of that is when entire neighborhoods aren't there anymore, right? I was at a FEMA conference earlier this year, and someone made that point that your strategy, your package of strategies, has to include moving people away from the most vulnerable areas.
Yeah.
We discussed this earlier. As a mayor, losing your tax base, it sounds like hell, right? But at some point, you were saying it's better to have people out of danger than to have a tax base that keeps on flooding. I know from my reporting there are many other mayors either considering that question or actively avoiding considering that question. What is your advice for them? How do you, as a forward-looking mayor, how would you recommend they consider the question of when is it time not to rebuild in a given neighborhood?
Well, every neighborhood is different. You have to look at the facts, the statistics, and the reality. And if any reasoned conclusion is that it's no longer sustainable, then you have to sell it. And it's you don't want. That's not something you just shoot from the hip about, and you have to take it very seriously. But I think we will see that in some coastal areas, as I mentioned, the 46 homes in a suburban part of Charleston, and then people are awakening to that as well. Your house gets flooded one time, that's a real pain in the neck. 6 times in 15 years, and you just can't take it anymore. So I think that's a biting the bullet that I think increasingly will be done.
Anything you want to add before we open up?
I agree. I mean, you have to look at each situation individually, apply some reason, logic to it, and make a decision. I think that, try not to make the political decision, but make the decision that's right for the people in that community. And for the other taxpayers that keep paying for it over and over again. You'll know when not to do it.
Have we got some questions in the audience or from Twitter that we could take? Right here.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you to Pew for this. I'm Alice Hill. I'm with the Hoover Institution. And I have a question about a perfect storm that we have brewing with regard to flood damage and infrastructure. We've heard that NFIP is heavily subsidized by the federal government. Our flood maps, as you all are well aware, do not reflect future risk. Our model building codes do not reflect the future risk of flooding. And we have a $1 trillion budget package for infrastructure proposed by President Trump today. That budget package does not mention either the words climate or resilience. So in order to achieve investments in resilient infrastructure going forward, what are communities like yours to do?
Well, we start. I was with Senator McConnell not too long ago, and he pointed out every president's budget is dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate. So I think we need to sit down with level heads in both bodies of the Congress, and you gave us a very good list to follow. So we need to work on each of these things in this budget so that it works for the people in this country. I think almost everyone would like to see their taxes go down. However, we need to do, government is there to do things to make communities safe and resilient. It's very basics of government, along with policing and fire protection, clean water, and so on. And it's a relatively easy argument to make that we need to, at the federal level, have good planning in partnership with local communities and states, good planning in place for natural disasters. It's just a no-brainer.
To piggyback on Alice's question, there's obviously deep public ambivalence about the notion that the taxpayer should be on the hook for this stuff, right? I mean, that proposal to cut those programs wouldn't be in the budget unless they included a significant share of American voters don't really want to pay for those kinds of programs. How do you change that? How do you begin to shift the needle in terms of public willingness to pay for more protection against floods and climate change?
I don't know that I would accept the assumption that the public's, do we have a survey, do we have some scientific data that show that most people actually don't want to pay, don't want to, in essence, kick into the insurance program that's the federal government in these areas?
Okay, I'll look for those numbers.
I don't,
I'll find them for you.
I think if I asked most of my constituents, they would say, sure, we need to. This is very basic government. We need to do those things. I think we have some very disconnected representatives in Washington that may have proposed some of these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that we didn't have a glacial shift in the last election. It was a very close election, and you know, and America is, you know, is diverse and robust. So I don't think, respectfully, it was a call for, you know, major restructuring. And I mean, I think that there's so many things that that should only be done at the local level. You know, running your police departments and you know, and your fire departments and your rec department and all that. But I think national resources to have a commonality of flood mapping is really important. I mean, it's all done with local input, but there are things, you know, we have a national highway system, and we have a lot of good national things that doesn't mean we're not a robust country like we were before, of different ideas and strong local feelings, but we need local, we need national, and I think that the national flood mapping and flood insurance and programs they make us stronger as a country. No one's getting off the hook, but we need to. Otherwise, we will have injuries to us as a people because we don't have the basic infrastructure, and that's a form of infrastructure. These are forms of infrastructure that we need.
I just don't know anyone that voted for their Congress or their House representative or their senator on the basis that one side or the other was going to destroy the federal flood insurance program. That's what they weren't thinking about when they cast their vote. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think most people would I think most people are going to want to help their neighbor that may have been the victim of a natural disaster. I don't think that's what the election was about at all.
I see a question on that side of the room. Is there a mic?
I'm Terry Hill. I'm with the eMerge Alliance. One of the items that I don't hear discussed much about is the vulnerability of the grid to disruption. And I'm wondering, Mayor, in all the development that you oversaw, did you ever think about the role of microgrids might play in new developments and mitigating, like after Sandy here on the East Coast, a lot of work and a lot of money going into microgrids. Is anybody looking towards the future of the grid and how it can contribute really to resiliency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm somewhat optimistic about that, and my city happens to have the Midwest Independent System Operator, which controls the grid for most of the eastern half of the country. And I like to joke with a lot of my friends from New York, they have to be nice or I'll make sure their lights are turned off. And we deal with the security issues. We have about 1,200 electrical engineers going to that facility daily. And so we have a lot of people in our community that are discussing these issues. And I think FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates the electrical grid in this country, is doing a good job at computerizing and having the various ISOs around the country coordinate among the various private and public electrical utilities. I think one of the things that's important to do is continue to incentivize alternative forms of electricity. Windmill, more than likely, and a flood is going to continue to keep going around. Solar panels are going to continue to work. And if we have a variety of sources of electricity and not reliant on any one particular source, we're much stronger.
Any more questions we could take? One here.
I'm Jerry Galloway from the University of Maryland. I'd like to follow up on the question about the national look at sharing. Every time we try and share something, and you can take a federal standard, its pushback comes from many of the local groups. Some states enforce it, some don't. We've talked about building standards. We most recently had the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which Professor Hill over there was certainly behind. And immediately people said, I don't want stricter standards. And therefore, the people that enforce standards, and your cities are in that boat, many Midwestern communities do that. They have stricter standards. They're, in fact, subsidizing those that decide they're just not going to do it. So how do you get the federal government to invoke policies that will be enforced at the local level in order that there's an equitable distribution of these support structures when we have a disaster? Did they participate or not? And when FEMA has suggested there ought to be a penalty for those that don't, there's pushback that the federal government shouldn't be doing that.
Well, I think if the federal government is engaged, if it's through a subsidy or flood insurance, if you will, then there's that's reasonable requirement. And in Charleston, we opted for the higher standards, and higher freeboard, and all of that. So I think it's, I do think hopefully I'm the most optimistic person you will meet maybe, but I do think that our country is awakening, and why what Pew is doing is so important. I'm so proud to be working with them is that the growing awareness and build that growing awareness that we have this challenge here of weather events, sea level rise or whatever that is caused by climate change. And so it makes national standards that go to a bottom line about whether or not our nation has been injured greatly by an event become more important.
I think I got a 5-minute warning. We got time maybe for one or two. Are there any remaining questions we can take before? Was that a hand up over there? Yeah? Right over here. Yeah, is there a mic?
Thank you. Mike Moriarty, FEMA, New York City. Mayor Riley, or both mayors, interested in your thoughts about strategic retreat, and I heard you speak generally, but if you could get a little bit more specific about how you prioritize those areas that really we need to move away from, and then what is the mechanism for doing it with transparency or not, for the political side of the house? How do you go about presenting that and carrying it through? Because we'd be willing to help. We just want to make sure that there's, a good open dialogue about how we do that.
I think the way to do it is through the federal flood insurance program. And there needs to be an incentive. Okay, maybe you get the cost of rebuilding. If you stay, the cost of rebuilding plus 20 or 30%. If you have to pick up and relocate, perhaps relocate in an area where the land is going to cost more because it's not in a floodplain. I think it has to be an incentive in the bill or in the insurance program to start with, and then at a certain point becomes mandatory, but the incentive then applies, so that that person who, maybe had $100,000, $200,000 house and the land's worth $1,000, now has to go buy a $200,000 house in an area where the land may be worth another $100,000. We need to compensate through that insurance program to make it easier for them to do that. I think that many times is a barrier. That person can't afford to go rebuild with the insurance proceeds that they receive unless there's some sort of incentive to move out of that flood area.
If there's one final question, we got time. There is.
So my girlfriend went to Carmel High School, and my first job was in Charleston. So there's a personal attachment to both of these.
Well, you obviously got a good job because you had a good education.
You said your first girlfriend or your current?
Well, current girlfriend,
okay.
Most important one. Both of your communities have significantly wealthy and influential populations. For you, Mayor Riley, many of these individuals live in some of the most vulnerable areas like the Battery. You also have the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum who are incredibly vulnerable as well. So I wanted to know what hurdles and solutions you have both experienced or implemented that address the needs and, frankly, the wants of both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum.
Well, a city is for everyone, and you make it clear to everyone, and it's important to everyone, irregardless of their station, wealth, or resources, and you have to continually communicate that, not just by your words, by what you do. You make sure that everyone who lives in your community feels that they're a part of it, and that it's a great community is one. I mean, it's a great community, but it's the diversity of incomes and experiences make it richer, because we do better as a society when we share. And the city, I can go on about the city is sharing. Public parks shared by everyone, rich people, poor people, all of that. So you do your very best to make sure that your citizens have reason, confidence, that you're equally interested in them, and then act like you are.
We actually have a final question over here.
Well, I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to make a statement. My job is around here as the old senior citizen pew to come and listen to all the forums and so forth, and to make a comment or two. Hopefully it contributes. I want to make this observation. I've been in politics for 40 years. Everybody would say that's too damn long, and you're right. But it was paid well and kept me out of trouble. I never got indicted, and here I am. So I want to single out the mayors. You very kindly said a few words about me. But if all the people serving the United States as volunteers, and all of them are volunteers, nobody forces you into politics. You get up and do it on your own initiative. There's something stirring inside you that you have an obligation to help this great country and your community. Senators, best job of all, because I tell you, when we were kids, we were taught how to play hide and seek. Well, a senator, of course, it's not as true as when I was there. You could get away with a lot, but now all with the social media, they can track you pretty well. There's even a little advice you can stick up under your car frame now and track you where you drive everywhere. But in the old days when we were slipping around, I thought nothing of jumping an airplane, going over to Europe for a weekend, do this, that, and come back.
everybody say, "How you been, John?" "I've been fine. How you been?" And they didn't know where I'd been. These two men, mayors, cannot play hide and seek. They're in their communities. They probably don't have security around their house like the governor and a policeman out there. They are there with their their family, wife, and children, and they have to respond to everything imaginable. They're supposed to have answers to all the questions. I knew one there one time, he was rather comical. He used to have a bulge in his pocket, and I said, "What is in the pocket?" He said, "Well, I carry Band-Aids around. You'd be surprised how many people need a Band-Aid." I usually give them a Band-Aid, answer the question, and skip on about my business. But we thank you for volunteering, both of you, for long, distinguished careers, and you can't play hide and seek. You answered every call. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's so nice.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
You did well.
You did it.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Now we know about the hide-and-go-seek tricks of our U.S. Congress. Before these gentlemen step off the stage, we are delighted to announce that they are going to be signing a statement of principles, which is a little statement in support of smart and durable infrastructure policies. They are joining together as a bipartisan group of current and former mayors, and we're hoping that they will be joined by members from around the country, leaders that are being as proactive as both of them are in their communities to face some of these future threats that we face and to be sort of proactive on the ground. So I'm going to ask both mayors if they can walk over to this statement and sign it. And I'm just going to read off the brief principles that they've agreed to as they're signing this. Improve resiliency requirements for buildings and infrastructure systems built before and after flood-related catastrophes. Enhance the use of natural defenses in planning and preparedness. And reduce unsustainable development in high-risk areas.
Congratulations, Joe.
Thank you both. We're going to invite now our policy panel up to the stage. I think we need maybe one more chair. So as seats get situated, I'll just introduce our panelists. We are joined by three different personalities, three different backgrounds representing different perspectives on how to most strategically deploy federal infrastructure dollars to make communities more resilient in the face of increasing flood disaster threats. Our first panelist, Harriet Tregoning, who's sitting in the middle, is the immediate past Assistant Secretary of Community and Planning at HUD, otherwise known as President Obama's Chief Resiliency Officer. Previous to joining the administration, Harriet worked for both the City of D.C. and Maryland under Governor Glendening in the Planning Office. And while she was at HUD, she oversaw the $1 billion natural disaster resiliency competition. Charles Brittingham, to my left here, is a senior vice president at Cassidy and Associates. He's a former policy advisor for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He worked for both Senators Vitter from Louisiana and Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma. He led Senate Republican negotiations on the most recent Water Resources Development Act, WRDA, and on two highway reauthorization bills, the FAST Act and MAP 21. The FAST Act authorized $305 billion over fiscal years 2016 and to 2020 for highway infrastructure. And on my far left is Lawrence Vandertak from CH2M Hill. He's a vice president of water resources and ecosystem management. He is widely recognized water resource engineer and expert on adaptation strategies, including storm surge and sea level rise. He's currently overseeing projects all over the country, Miami-Dade, Boston, North Carolina, in our backyard, Washington, D.C., on infrastructure and natural infrastructure. So we've asked these three to really join us here today to have a real conversation about a path forward on policy. We know that the U.S. invests $4 billion annually in infrastructure. Around 100 of that comes from the federal government, most of which goes towards highways and bridges. Despite significant spending, the U.S. lags behind EU and China on infrastructure spending as a percentage of GDP. We all know that spending can both put people to work and grow our economy, and if done wisely, it can change the way we design, build, and maintain our roads, bridges, dams, schools, hospitals as a means of mitigating flood risk. Harriet, I'll start with you. Last week was Infrastructure Week. Lots of events around town here that kept everyone busy about infrastructure. It's the 5th annual of such events that is organized to draw attention to the need for infrastructure in the U.S. economy. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao kicked off the week at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce last Monday, urging decisive action on addressing America's infrastructure problems and pledging that the administration will share its coming vision in coming weeks. I think we saw a little glimpse of that today. While we know the path forward remains unclear, very complicated, the good news is that this administration has put infrastructure on the table. We are presented with an opportunity. As the federal government looks to address these issues and Congress debates major investments, which we know will not be an easy debate, and policies towards infrastructure, how do we ensure that that money is deployed to meet multiple needs, multiple benefits that will ultimately create the resilient communities that our mayors just talked about?
That's a really great question, and I'm really happy that we at least have something to talk about in terms of infrastructure. I think the most important thing to remember is to put it in context that of all the money that gets spent in the country on infrastructure, the federal government is a minority funder, right? They spend about 25% of everything that's spent. So I think the real opportunity is to use that money that we're going to put out to try to influence the rest of the money that's being spent on infrastructure. So increasingly, the federal government isn't the major funder of anything. They act as a catalyst. They act as a gap funder. So I think putting the money out in a way that incentivizes how those other dollars get spent, so that means probably competitively and to meet multiple needs. And it also means not to be in too much of a hurry. I think anybody who works in local government knows that you've got a stack of projects going back 40 or 50 years in your community that people would love to spend money on, but those 40-year-old projects may not have been a good idea 40 years ago, and I can guarantee you they're not built for the future that we're facing and the kind that our two mayors just discussed. So we need to make sure that people are putting infrastructure projects together that will really meet the needs of the future and also the other needs of communities. So getting as close to those local needs as possible is going to be very important. So not just what will the state spend, I know that's our brand of federalism, but what can we do to influence all that local money that's getting spent where other needs could be met, like needs for jobs, needs to revitalize neighborhoods, needs to create more economic opportunity, that those needs that are so important at the local level, they also get met with this infrastructure spending.
And as a follow-up to that, how is, some of the programs that you oversaw, like the HUD $1 billion grant, resiliency grant program, what is the role of the federal government in working with local communities? Is it programs like HUD's grant program? Are there other ways in which the federal government can encourage a sort of bottom-up approach?
I think there definitely is a way to do that, but and I appreciate your calling it HUD's program, but in fact, we worked with more than 24 federal agencies to put that program together from the time that we began to write the notice of funding availability all the way through to the selection of projects, because it turns out all kinds of federal agencies have programs that could either be working toward that objective that we put out in the $1 billion National Disaster Resilience Competition, or working at odds with that program. So by getting everybody together, it made it much more likely that we would all be going in the same direction, which saves money, right? Which makes that spending much more efficient and effective. But I also think that is an example of a contest that took a long time. It took a year. We did it in 2 phases. In the first phase, we wouldn't even let anyone talk about projects, only about their needs in communities, their risks, their vulnerabilities, and so many of the things that the mayors talked about that face their communities. One of the biggest stresses is poverty and unemployment and disparities. So how could infrastructure spending affect that? Well, lots and lots of ways. So by talking about what are those stresses, not just the last flood, but the thing that makes it hard to recover from a flood, those are the things that also can be addressed with this infrastructure spending. And I think the most gratifying thing about that contest was that at the end of a year, right, we'd done it in 2 phases, more than 67 original applicants, 40 people going on to the final phase, 13 winners. The most gratifying thing was the communities that didn't win told us afterward if they had to live life all over again, they would still enter that competition because it was worth it to learn what they learned and to form the partnerships that they formed. The 13 winners had 220 partnerships that they formed, and they brought $5 billion to the table to match our $1 billion. And it took a year to get that to happen, but another way to think about it, it only took a year to get all that to happen. So that would be my advice.
Lawrence, the conversation about infrastructure and investment has made strong calls for private sector engagement, more private sector engagement. From your position where you sit from an industry perspective, how can policy drive private sector engagement and more investment towards resiliency?
Well, we are driven in our business by infrastructure investment. So obviously more investment in infrastructure, we definitely thrive on that. But more importantly, I want to make 2 points about resilience and infrastructure through my 30 years of working on flood control and water and wastewater systems throughout the country. A couple of points actually the mayors made earlier is that we need to be thinking about this in a very, very long-term sense. We've talked an awful lot here about FEMA basically setting a threshold. Today's 100-year storm is not tomorrow's 100-year storm. But most infrastructure, I think Chris Flavelle asked the question earlier about let's look long-term, 10, 20, 30 years. I'm doing a master plan across the river here for the city of Alexandria where a lot of the storm drainage was actually laid out by George Washington.
Wow.
So infrastructure actually is very, very long-term in many cases. Typically, we think of short-term in infrastructure for electrical, mechanical systems as being 20, 30 years. Medium to long-term is maybe 50 years, and long-term is more like 100 years. If you're going to put in a tunnel like you're putting in Charleston, it's probably going to be there 100 years from now. So you need to be planning for the climate or weather, whatever term you want to use, that's going to happen in 100 years' time. So policy is going to be important for us by setting what those standards are. And we're working with clients all the time in deciding what the future design standards should be. Like a project for Miami-Dade County right now that we're doing, it's a $5 billion wastewater program. We're basically planning for how protective systems should be with storm surge and sea level rise in the year 2075 and beyond. So policy will really, really help us set a consistent standard going forward with those particular issues. The other thing is resilience investments. We're finding time and time again is a very small part of the overall infrastructure investment. As an example, that Miami-Dade project I mentioned a moment ago, it's about $5 billion. We figured out the cost, the incremental cost just to provide resilience in 2075 is about $75 million. Sounds like a big number, but that's less than 2%.
Wow. Charles, you were in the Senate. You were able to get work across the aisle, get things done in the Senate EPW committee, and tackle bipartisan legislation on both transportation and water infrastructure. Given our challenges that we're faced now, what lessons do you have for me and all of us in this room, really, as we look to Congress to address infrastructure?
Thank you. I appreciate the question, Laura. I would say probably the top priority would be to educate the staff. Given the change in administration, a lot of the institutional knowledge or the thought leaders are moving towards the administration or towards the private sector. So the key piece is getting up there and educating these younger staffers, these staffers that haven't worked on major infrastructure bills, educating them on your issue. I mean, if you allow there to be a void in understanding of the policies or your agendas, they're going to get lost in the shuffle. And that's currently what I see happening right now with, and I don't want to name the EPW committee purposely, but that was the committee that I came from. The majority of the staff that I worked with have since left and gone to the private sector or have gone to the administration. And they're starting with a new group of folks that haven't necessarily sat through a conference or have put transportation or water resource policy together, but educate those folks. I see Sam Medlock in the crowd, and I remember Sam Medlock and Larry Larson coming up many years ago and sitting with me in one of the EPW rooms and having a discussion. And while at the time we might have been on different sides of the coin that she was discussing, over the years, continuous contact with Sam and to some extent Larry, I was able to see and able to educate myself on what is a priority for them. Jerry Galloway, I've read several of your papers. I've seen you on several documents, several NAS stuff. So I would say education is probably the key. Second, be bipartisan. When I dealt with Senator Boxer's staff, now not just once on Word of 14 and MAP 21, but again for the FAST Act, as well as the recent WIN Act, was we found commonality among the staff. We may not have always agreed, but we were able to work amicably sitting at the table because we found that commonality and we found that understanding of the particular issues. I come from the state of Louisiana, whereas of course Boxer's staff were principally we're concerned with California issues, but we were able to sit down in a bipartisan fashion and come up with solutions, and not perfect. I mean, no bills are ever perfect, but we came up with solutions that would benefit our members and our caucuses. 3, know your audience. I'll give you a good story. So I had a young lady come in, and she really didn't know who she was speaking with. So she came in and she was talking about Word of 14 language, and she kept telling me about this language. She kept saying, "Do you understand the language? Do you understand the language?" She had no idea. I actually wrote that language. So, know your audience. Go in there prepared. Be innovative, and that leads me to my 4th point. One of the greatest innovative educational tools I ever saw was how the House handled Word of 14. 60%, and I should get this right, 60% of the members of the House in 2014 were not around when the last Word of bill was passed. So the House staff on TNI had to educate each and every member, and they did it colorfully. They had all these colorful pamphlets. They got on Twitter. They were pushing the idea of Word of 14 to their members and explained to them projects in their communities, whether they had core projects or not, but projects that benefited them and why the bill was so important. So I would say, and I thought the video you did earlier was fantastic, but as you continue to keep pushing your message and your agenda, think about the marketing tools. A friend of mine, Jeff Bowman, who works on House TNI, we always used to say, don't give staffers an 8.5 by 11 white piece of paper, because we have hundreds of those on our desk. Give us something small. Give us something like this that's not traditional, that's not going to get lost in the shuffle, that we will continue to have year in and year out. In fact, I've still got some laminated stuff that's probably over a decade old. So I would say educate the staff. Do not lose interest. Continue to keep using that slow drip. Don't get caught in the peaks and valleys where everybody comes up in March, then you don't see them for 3 or 4 months, and they come again in October, and you only get that information 2 times a year. Continue the slow drip. Make sure that you're constantly there every 2 weeks, once a month. Make sure that the staffers understand your agenda and your priorities. Be innovative, be bipartisan, and find commonality.
And as we look to the future of infrastructure, are you seeing areas where there is bipartisan support, where there are committees working in a bipartisan way?
Yes and no. So I do know some staff in the Senate and some staff in the House that are working on proposals for an infrastructure plan, kind of in their own silos. And you almost have to look at the makeup of the committees to understand what's going on. Chairman Barrasso, who is a great member of the Senate, Chairman Barrasso is from Wyoming, and Chairman Barrasso doesn't have, at least in the state of Wyoming, many Army Corps of Engineer projects. So he's going to struggle if you're trying to explain to him subsidence or sea level rise, for instance, in a city of Charleston or state of Louisiana or the coast of Texas. He's probably not going to understand that. So it's just a matter of, helping his staff formulate and put together good policies. And I know the same thing on the House side is even worse. You have 435 members. So you actually have to engage many more members to get them to understand. And there are some challenges out there.
So it seems like it's really easy to ask for money and make calls for money. There are pressures from local communities, states, and the federal government to pay for infrastructure. But what I find most striking is that the federal government is the one who's paying to rebuild infrastructure time and time again. I think we calculated a number to be roughly around $51 billion that FEMA has paid out to rebuild infrastructure from 2005. Are there smart policies that are needed that could be put in place or that are in place now to ensure that when the federal government is investing taxpayer dollars following a disaster, that we're building smartly, that we're rebuilding smartly, that we're taking the long view and not just recovering quickly?
So I think one of the smartest things to do is to not build in the first place in the wrong place. So one of the things that was a feature of the last administration was the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard Executive Order. The intention was that all the federal agencies would adopt that requirement. It's a pretty simple thing. It basically requires that we build more freeboard in areas that are subject to flooding, recognizing what all of us know, that the FEMA flood maps, as marvelous as they are, as updated as frequently as they are, they look backward. They're not predictive. And that in 2016 alone, we had 38 presidentially declared disasters. Only 2 of them were named storms, Hameen and Matthew. Almost everything else was heavy rain. Just heavy rain, not a big name storm. There were 2 1,000-year events and several 500-year events in 2016. That's our future. So we have to figure out, how we avoid putting people in harm's way, and that's the least costly way to avoid paying for huge disasters. Other people talked about what do we do about repetitive losses. We're not very good at this at the federal government. We kind of come upon people in the wake of a disaster and say, take our check or not. And a lot of people are like, I'm not ready to figure this out. We don't give states a lot of guidance to administer a disaster recovery program. Every state does it differently. Even in the wake of Sandy, states had very different approaches to how they did this. If people knew up front that there was going to be a cap on how much the government was going to pay to rebuild their home, right? Maybe it's 2 times the pre-storm value. Maybe it's 2.5 times the pre-storm value, but it's not 10 times. That cap would help people understand whether or not it's better for them to try to move to a different place. Maybe at 2.5 times they might only get 80% of the cost of rebuilding their house. Maybe they'd rather take that 2.5 times value and move to a safer place. But we need to think about these things up front so that people have that opportunity, and also do what the private sector does. They don't buy people out necessarily instantly. We have all these great land conservation organizations. They offer something called a life tenancy, right? They use the power of the tax code. If there's a difference between your appraised value and what FEMA or HUD is willing to give you, take it as a tax deduction to the conservation organization, and you're either out of your house when you die, or the next time it's utterly flattened by a storm. And that gives you the chance to build the memories with your family that you'd hope to have, or it gives you a sum of money that would enable you to buy another house or leave some other legacy for your family members, which is the thing that seems to be very important to people. So, I think we just need to be creative and work with people who have a lot of experience in this to figure out how we manage it over time. It doesn't have to be instantly. We need it to happen, before we're paying for that house three more times.
One quick note, the state of Florida has a law called their Adaptation Action Area Law that basically, I don't think it's mandatory, but communities along the coast basically do planning on the face of sea level rise and build this into their comprehensive plan. And essentially they divide land into 3 different categories. I may have the names wrong, but essentially there's protect, accommodate, and abandon, or managed retreat, as was mentioned earlier. They come up with the criteria themselves on how they would actually define those and whether or not they want to make the investment to protect if it's their downtown business district. But just having that land use plan makes it a lot clearer going forward if you are going to recover from an event where you are going to target your future development. Helps a lot.
I think one of the things you have to do from a federal perspective, particularly a congressional perspective, and it's something I've tried to do over the past 5 or 6 years, if not 12, which is reform the programs internally. What always sticks out in my mind, and I had this conversation with somebody earlier today, is the $8 to $9 billion lost in Louisiana last August because of the rainfall. What struck me even more is I know for a fact I'd worked on 2 particular projects in the area that the progress on those projects had dragged their feet. And it had been 12, 13 years, and something that I had worked on intricately on a daily basis could have prevented anywhere from 20 to 50% of the flooding that existed. And I think that is just a fault of the current underfunding of the Army Corps of Engineer program, as well as providing some accountability on the local level. And that was one thing that I saw is you guys have a core project. The Corps spent at the time 12 years, 20 years, now it's up to 3 years doing a study. We get you an authorized project out of Congress, and now that project sits on the shelf because the non-federal sponsor doesn't meet its particular obligations, or it doesn't compete favorably in what I consider to be a broken budgetary system that exists up here. So let's start, again, let's get back into a WRDA 18 or a WRDA 2020, and let's try to continue to keep reforming the program. You look at $8 billion that came out of the Disaster Relief Fund. Had you spent those millions up front in providing some level of protection, and I'm not talking necessarily about structural protection, I'm talking non-structural protection as well, you would have saved billions down the road in the recovery costs. So where's the better investment for taxpayer dollars? I think it's on the front end.
So I'm going off script. Why doesn't $1 in, $4 saved resonate with Congress?
It's difficult translating anything to Congress because your first layer of defense is the staff. So when we tried to explain the cost savings for WIFIA, for water infrastructure that was authored in 2014, even doing the modifications in the WIN Act, it was difficult explaining that. It's something that just gets lost. It's like, it's paper money, it doesn't exist. Nor do you have kind of real world examples where you could point to and say, here's a great cost savings. Or if you do, they're just not marketed or translated properly to the staff. And it's stuff that gets lost in the 8.5 by 11 paper and doesn't get translated to the members. Remember, Congress is political, so a lot of decisions are going to be made on behalf of counting political votes, so on and so forth.
I think there are 2 other reasons. I think that the disasters don't strike the country evenly, and even though we could all say it's highly likely that every place in the country is going to be affected in the next 50 years, 20 years, 10 years, like what actually happens before that congressman's election is really unknown, and maybe in their calculus not worth the risk. So we have parts of the country where I think those members of Congress, you would think they would reliably vote for prevention because they are reliably hit, and Florida and Louisiana are 2 of those places. And yet, even there, they're not necessarily voting for prevention. But in other parts of the country that aren't coastal, it's even more of a crapshoot. So I think trying to help people understand time and probability and how all of this works would be beneficial. And if the dollars spent didn't do just one thing, the only benefit, if the only benefit is when you have a disaster, that's actually not a good expenditure of money. We could spend this money in a way that actually met the goals of communities, like it could provide jobs. It could revitalize a downtown. It could put housing in the right place. You know, it could provide more affordability. We could go on and on. So I think we need to do a better job of talking about the multifaceted nature of those investments and the benefits that people could get today, whether or not there was a disaster this year, next year, or the year after.
I actually agree wholeheartedly with Harriet, and that's something I've seen over the past couple of years where you're not looking at singular one-off projects, but you're looking at multi-purpose projects that serve several different functions. Those are the ones that are rising to the top at this point instead of your singular one-off, so I agree.
That leads very nicely into my next question about nature-based solutions. Speaking of multiple benefits, we often tout nature-based solutions using nature as a natural way to absorb floodwaters and reduce risk as a first line of defense that is both economical, it's long-lasting, and it can often provide multiple benefits to a community. One of our challenges is always communicating it, you know, in a dollars and cents way. We do have some research that shows the economic benefits. One study found that coastal wetlands provide an estimated $23 billion each year in storm protection benefits. I often liken nature-based solutions to an emerging technology. They need a policy to sort of kickstart a market. They're a little bit like a new technology. And I feel that when we talk to members of Congress about it. It's a little unknown, right? We're kind of navigating a new world. So are there ways that we can create a better policy environment, a better regulatory environment that will encourage more use of natural infrastructure?
I think there are a couple of things that we could absolutely do. I mean, in the National Disaster Resilience Competition, we used benefit cost analysis for the first time in the federal government to look at nature-based solutions and to look at a much broader range of social costs, recognizing that we have to go this way if we ever want to get if we ever want to fund projects where we have to do benefit cost analysis, we need a more sophisticated way of doing that. So we got a lot of help from the Department of Transportation and from other federal agencies to help us do that because HUD had never done benefit cost analysis for any of its programs. So that was something where we really relied on our colleagues for assistance. So let's not talk about whether that was a good idea to never do it at HUD for other purposes. Let's not do that. But that was an important step. But I think the other thing that we have to think about, the thing that most local governments and states have thought of as a bad thing, labor, things that would increase labor, i.e. maybe increase costs, I think we have to increasingly see that as potentially a virtue. So, you know, this might be a little off topic, but we've lost 90,000 jobs out of retail so far in 2017. The biggest category of male employment on planet Earth is driving. And we're all excited, some of us, about autonomous vehicles. Automation is taking a lot of these middle wage jobs out of the economy. And if cities aren't thinking about where those new jobs are coming from, then I don't know who would be. So I think the thing about nature-based solutions, they have to be designed, they have to be built, they have to be maintained, right? And they can't be maintained mechanically. So we need labor. We need people to be doing this. And that is going to be increasingly a good thing because cities are paying the costs for the unemployed and the underemployed. So when cities draw the box big enough around these solutions, they might find it actually is economical. But we have to be thinking about where the next jobs are going to be coming from. And I think nature-based solutions provide a really great example of those multiple benefits that cities really are looking for.
I think one of the best educational tools for me is the Louisiana State Coastal Master Plan. They've done a couple iterations. They just did one recently in 2017. And it took me looking at that. Actually, it took me standing on the shores of Kenner, Louisiana, and speaking with now Congressman Garrett Graves, who was the executive director of CPRA at the time. And Garrett said, These folks didn't build on the coast. The coast came to them. What we have to do is give the coast back to them. So when you look at that state master plan, you'll see several different layers of non-structural and structural measures that the state is trying to implement using federal dollars, using non-federal dollars, local state tax dollars. And to me, that was the best educational tool. So I would say, you know, as you look at things holistically, at least from your perspective and from a staffer's perspective, is look at that state master plan and see the projects that they have out there, such as you know, beach restoration for Caminada Island just near Port Fourchon, you know, dredging up, going 35 miles off the coast of Louisiana, dredging up sand and pumping it up as sand berms, you know, onto the shore to protect the wetlands that are behind it, as well as the Mid-Barataria river diversion that's being proposed right now to restore Louisiana's coastal wetlands using sediment out of the Mississippi River. I think Louisiana's got a phenomenal plan, and I applaud the authors of those over the years.
Just add two words real quickly. We do an awful lot of nature-based solutions, but one of the real challenges we often find, especially if you're trying to provide flood control, is people want certainty. I mean, are we protecting to the 100-year storm and so forth? And nature-based solutions tend not to have that certainty. You know, I hate to have the pun, there's gray area and the gray versus green transition. But in terms of doing cost-benefit analysis, it is probably the most useful thing to demonstrate the benefits that you get from green infrastructure systems. If you can look at sort of a whole range of storms, a whole range of other benefits that you get. What would happen if you don't do anything? What would the benefit be provided? You know, so the cost of no action, as I call it. So there's definitely a lot of positive stories out there that we could point to.
I think we've got a couple minutes for questions from the audience. We figured it all out.
Hi, Tom Horner with Water Management. I'm curious what your thoughts are on Blackstone Group's announcement the other day of combination with KSA on a infrastructure fund. That's Saudi Arabia, I believe is a $100 billion fund. And is the private sector going to be stepping up to fill the gap?
That is one of the proposals that I know is currently sitting on the table. I mean, all you have to do is go back to Secretary Elaine Chao's hearing in front of Commerce where P3 was discussed ad nauseum, and I can't pick up a press story where P3s are not involved in some form or fashion. It's difficult though. I mean, P3s maybe in a highway context may work because you have a revenue source, so you're going to get a return on that investment. But you look at flood protection that you spend $1 billion for flood protection. How is the local community going to be able to supplant that return on investment? You know, I can think of some cases, and again, I harken back to Louisiana because it seems like they do have their act together to some point. The Mid-Barataria, the BP money, being able to do a project through a P3, use the Army Corps of Engineers for the 404 and 408 permit, and do a 35-year annuity with upfront money. I mean, I can see where something like that would occur. But you know, you look at other challenges with Fargo-Moorhead that the Corps is currently undertaking right now in the Dakotas, and they're having challenges with respect to the P3 and some of the hurdles that exist at Treasury. So I think in some cases, you know, water delivery systems, highways, where you're going to get that return on investment, I can see P3 where private equity is going to be at the table. But in others, I just can't see where there is an actionable path forward for a public-private partnership.
I honestly think that there might be more opportunity in this resilience area than in other areas. You know, obviously, some places will simply sell the private, you know, what is the public infrastructure to the private sector and let them run it how they will, charging whatever they will. That may not be the best answer for many types of things. But if you think about your previous question about nature-based systems, and if you think about, you know, about how we're growing to understand what resilience means and what protection means, why would anyone ever build a berm or a levee if a waterfront park would provide the same level of protection? You know, in Mayor Brainerd's case, it might be that you would build that waterfront park and then you would have dense development right next to it, denser than in other parts of the city. That tax base would then pay the bonds, right, that had been issued, or the you know, pay back the investors. But I think you'd have to look at it in those kinds of ways. So it's not just the investment itself. It's also what is the ancillary benefit that could be provided in real estate might be part of that in some cases. The other place that looks promising is with is stormwater in general, because utilities typically run that. They independently can issue bonds. They independently can raise rates subject to regulation. So there's some ability, to pay those things back. But the multiple benefit projects are much more likely to get the support of the ratepayers and the regulators. And they're also, likely for forward-thinking utilities like the ones in DC and in Milwaukee to actually help the city meet some of its other goals. So I think there are some real opportunities in those areas, but I can't say that that applies to every kind of infrastructure this country needs.
We have a question over here.
Rob DeRocker. I do some work for Mayor Brainerd. Speaking of having their act together, as you look around the world, what countries are moving way ahead of the United States in this regard?
I'm going to have an unpopular answer. I love Turkey for one thing. They require everybody to have hazard insurance. It's a countrywide requirement. And think about how that would change things in the U.S. if every property owner had to have multi-hazard insurance. And let's say that insurance was also basically risk adjusted, those premiums. Now we suddenly have a price signal, a market signal, a risk signal to every single property owner about what they could do, either in terms of that location or in terms of a retrofit of their building to reduce their risk. It also informs the city. Maybe they could do an infrastructure solution where all the ratepayers behind that infrastructure now get lower rates. Well, that's a source of financing. That's a source of repayment for the financing, I should say. And that could be kind of a perpetual motion machine in cities. So I think we need to be looking at jobs. I hate to keep saying that, but jobs over and over again. And what are the things that would bring jobs to our communities while we also do the things that we need to do? So that's one example I like, and I appreciate the question.
From a structural perspective, I always say the Netherlands. In thinking with the city of New Orleans, I always think of Venice. I mean, there's going to come a point that it's not about structural protection, but it's about actually living with water and understanding that. And I think New Orleans has done at least the plans on paper, conceptually, they've been doing a good job, but it's been based off of Venice. But structurally, I always look at the Netherlands.
I would have said the Netherlands too, but my name's Vandertek, so I guess I'm a little biased.
There's a question over here. Okay.
Hi, Brittany Seiler with HHS and USDA. So private sector is very appealed by cities for the potential of essentially profits for making these public-private partnerships. How do you appeal also in the rural areas to get those kind of investments that are also happening in cities?
So there are 65,000 water and stormwater utilities around the country. Some of them don't have any of the kind of planning capacity that both of the mayors talked about. I mean, I think there's a real opportunity to do some level of consolidation in rural America for those kinds of services. Even if it's sort of like one high capacity utility ends up providing services, maybe procurement services, maybe other back office services, other things that would help to make that utility, the small utilities, much more effective. And I think anything we could do to encourage that would be really, really useful, because we're asking those utilities to deal with very difficult problems, and they just don't have the capacity to do it. So I think that would be one really terrific thing that USDA could specifically get involved in.
Very much. Samantha Medlock with Willis Towers Watson. Thank you very much for the shout out. I appreciate that. My question is in two parts, if you would. How can we, across the federal enterprise and across the private sector, get at more accurate and meaningful benefit cost analysis that more fully captures I think cost we've got a pretty good grasp on, but the full range of benefits through things like preserving natural services and getting a truer cost when we're looking at things like a setback levy or making room for the river. And then I would also ask you that same question as we head into the reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program. The opportunities in Water Resources Development Act and similar legislation I think are very helpful, and you covered them nicely, Charles. But what about as we head into the NFIP reauthorization? How can we help that program perform with better financial outcomes?
To address the first part of your question, it's almost like you're in my head, Sam. I think, and Jerry may disagree or agree with me, I think we have to turn how the Corps does their BCR calculations. I mean, I just had this conversation last night with somebody that OMB budgets at 7%, but a lot of the chiefs reports we get are at the current present day discount rate, which is 3.2%, et cetera. So you're looking at a lot of projects, water resource projects, that are going to sit on the shelves until they're deauthorized. And I can think of many that Congress has authorized that the local communities, whether it's Charleston, et cetera. In fact, I'll talk Charleston Harbor is a great example. I've talked to Barbara Melvin and Jim Newsom about the project they have that is just short of being budgeted for the simple fact that their BCR calculation doesn't meet OMB's budget criteria. And I think when you go back and you read through, and this is very wonky, the NED calculations that the Corps does for BCR and how national focused they are, and not really looking into the ancillary regional benefits or the setback levies or the ecosystem restoration component, so on and so forth, that the Corps not looking at that puts these projects at a disadvantage. And last night I made the suggestion, start looking at the local project level, look at the problems with the NED and the BCR calculations and turn it upside down. Get the Corps to look at this all over again and redo these and then retroactively look at some of those projects so that they'll have favorable BCRs, not just looking at national economic benefits, but looking at regional economic benefits and then looking at the benefits that come from byproducts of the project, such as you're building wetlands behind a levee, so on and so forth, and you're creating that. Have that stuff calculated into the BCR, have it at 7% instead of this arbitrary discount rate of the day, and ensure those projects are able to compete for federal funding. If not, we're going to go through this exercise in 10 more years where we're deauthorizing $15 billion worth of projects that never got a single dollar of federal funding. I would love to speak eloquently about the National Flood Insurance Program. I wish I could. When I look at the National Flood Insurance Program, I agree with what Harriet said about, if you build the infrastructure, you lower the rates, have that rate as a possibility for, P3 investment, so on and so forth. I always go back to the disaster relief fund and the money that is put into the disaster relief fund that is not put on the front end. You're not putting money out there for non-structural projects or structural projects that you're just not building, that you're looking at a very underfunded, archaic Army Corps of Engineer program that is wrought with inefficiencies, that you're continuing to keep spending. You're reactionary. You're not proactive. You're spending billions of dollars from the disaster relief fund, but you're not spending millions up front to protect, to provide, ecosystem restoration projects, whether the Everglades, whether it is the Louisiana coastal area, so on and so forth. So I think as the members on the Hill look at the National Flood Insurance Program, I think they're really going to have to take a step back and look for some innovative changes to the disaster relief program and NFIP.
And I would just suggest that if they're terrified of making wholesale changes, they have certainly been willing on the Hill to do pilots, to authorize pilots and experiments in legislation. So let's set up and let's propose a couple of experiments in places so that we can do these comparisons, right? So I think that's not a very hard thing to do. And I think you could also start to ask for more participation from states and local governments. If you can get the alignment, they have capital budgets. These two mayors have a CIP. Their states have CIPs. If you could get alignment between what they're trying to accomplish with those CIPs and what the city and the state is trying to accomplish with these projects, it would be easy to bring that money to the table. But when you're forbidden from having local benefits, regional benefits, statewide benefits, you can only meet these national criteria, it's hard to find the money. So yeah, I think that would solve it in a stroke of a pen.
Could I add one thing to that? There's been a tendency with all the past cost-benefit analyses to always look at the cost of damage avoided as the benefit today, but not necessarily repetitive losses for the next 50 years or so. And doing those sorts of analyses are not that complicated to do if you have the probability of repeat events well defined into the future. The science is there. I've got one example. For New York City, we did an evaluation of their wastewater infrastructure, and the cost of wastewater resilience was about $315 million. It seemed like a huge number, but when we looked at that compared to the cost of damage avoided out to the year 2050, the range of estimates of damage avoided was between $1 billion if there was just one Hurricane Sandy in 2050, so sea level rise in 2050. But if you had a series of tropical storm events, it was somewhere between around $2 to $2.6 billion. So the $315 million all of a sudden became a very good investment.
Wow. Well, I think I've got a pressing question from Senator Warner here in the front row, and then we will close this out.
Winston Churchill once opined that the primary function of any self-respecting legislator is to figure out how he or she can get reelected. To what extent do you find in your interfacing with the Congress any real interest in terms of the members trying to get behind some of these programs? And they do so because they can translate that into votes at the polling place the next time.
I see it as reactionary. I look at particular members that will have an issue in their state, and it really stretches across the mode or the sector of infrastructure. I see it as reactionary, and I see it's difficult explaining coastal problems to inland states, or it's difficult explaining rural states issues to folks like New York. I do see it as reactionary. I kind of miss that very beginning when I came up in 2005, that sort of bipartisan, let's try to work together to cut a deal, and a little less teeth pulling. Again, I go back to the education of the staff. You're only as strong as your weakest link, and sometimes that staff has got to be the strongest link with the communication to the member. So, again, I see there's a glimmer of hope and light because you see the fervor behind infrastructure at this point from Capitol Hill. It's very local. It's very parochial with respect to what their interests are, and as long as I can get my particular project or issue over the goal line, then I'll help you get yours. So, Senator, that's my thoughts.
I think that there is a willingness, but I think that for states that aren't seeing this degree of disaster, they still have core projects. Mm-hmm. They still have things they'd like to get done, and some of these rules affect them even if there's never going to be a disaster in their state, and that if they could get that alignment, that would, for the federal government, also unlock some of the state and local funding that's being spent, but that could be lined up with these federal projects. I think everyone could be happy with that. So they may not have the same reason for wanting to be interested. It may not be resilience, it may not be climate change, but they have projects that they have not been able to get funding for. And part of the reason is the way that we look at benefits in Corps of Engineer projects.
In an absence of no congressionally directed spending items, you have to look, and if you look at the members who voted for and against the past two WRDA bills, the highway bill, MAP 21, you'll see it was pretty close to unanimous, 400 and something in this House, 420 plus in the House, 90 plus something in the Senate, where most people are getting something that they're looking for, and it may not be project specific, but it's a general policy concern that affects maybe something in their state, but unanimously almost over for the last four bills.
Well, with that, I'll ask the panelists, unless they have anything pressing that we didn't get to. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. It's been a really, I know for me, informative discussion, and I hope everyone will take a little bit away from this. Please join us right through those doors. I think those doors. We'll have a little reception, and I think our mayors and our panelists will be around, too, for answering any more questions. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.